It began at 4:17 in the afternoon. Not with a gradual darkening, but with a sudden, chemical change in the light. The vast prairie sky, which had been a sheet of dull iron all day, was suddenly stained a bruised, greenish-yellow along the northern horizon. In the town of Providence, a collection of proud, sharp-angled timber buildings huddled on the plains, no one paid it much mind. Men moved from the saloon to the general store, their shoulders hunched against a wind that was merely ordinary for a late autumn day. They saw the sky, but they did not truly observe it. It was just more weather in a place defined by it. They trusted their straight walls, their milled lumber, and the comforting geometry of what they knew. But inside a low, strange structure on the eastern edge of town, a woman named Agnes felt the change in her bones. Her home had no sharp angles. It was a soft, rounded thing, its thick walls coated in a plaster of mud and lime that gave it the color of the very ground it sat upon. Inside, the world was quiet. The ordinary wind was not a rattling intruder but a distant murmur, a story happening somewhere else. Her German shepherd, Kaiser, who had been dozing by the small iron stove, lifted his great head. His ears did not prick with alarm, but swiveled slowly, listening to a frequency beyond human hearing. He let out a low, guttural sigh and laid his head back down on his paws, pressing closer to the radiating warmth. Agnes paused her mending, a wool sock draped over her hand. She looked at the oiled hide that covered the small, deep-set window opening. It glowed with the sickly yellow light from outside. She felt no fear. Only a profound and settling sense of inevitability, the quiet certainty of a single, correct decision finally meeting its purpose. While the town of Providence braced with arrogance, Agnes and her dog simply waited, cocooned in 3 feet of straw and earth, ready for the world to break. The decision to build such a house had not been an act of eccentricity, but of memory and mathematics. Her husband, Samuel, had been a farmer, a man who understood the prairie not as something to be conquered with saws and hammers, but as something to be negotiated with. He had spent his life watching the way the earth held the heat, the way the bison survived the winter, the way the very soil could be a shield. "Wood is proud, Agnes," he used to say, his hands tracing patterns in the dirt. "It stands up straight and tells the wind, 'Here I am,' but the earth is humble. It hunkers down and lets the trouble pass over." He had read books, strange pamphlets from Nebraska farmers who were experimenting, turning the useless stubble of their harvests into shelter. He spoke of it not as a fantasy, but as a kind of practical poetry. When the fever took him, it took all his plans with him, leaving Agnes with only the echo of his words and a widow's pension that was an insult to his life's labor. The town assumed she would leave, or perhaps move into a small room at the boarding house. Mr. Rowe, who owned the lumber mill and thus the town's very skeleton, had approached her with a ledger and a sympathetic frown. "We can arrange credit, of course," he'd said, his voice smooth with practiced pity. "A simple frame, 2 rooms. $80 for the lumber. You can work it off cleaning the church." $80 was a fortune she would never possess. It was a sentence of debt, a life of obligation. That evening, sitting with Kaiser in the cold shell of the cabin she had to leave, she remembered Samuel's words. The next day, she walked to the edge of the Henderson farm and looked at the great, golden stacks of straw left after the threshing. The farmer considered it waste. He planned to burn it. When she offered him $3 for 100 bales, he laughed, but he took the money. $3. That was the number that changed everything. It was a number of defiance. It was a number of survival. It was the last currency she had, and she was not investing it in pride or convention, but in the humble, ridiculous, life-saving wisdom of the man she had lost. The building of it was a spectacle for the entire town of Providence. Agnes, a woman of slight frame but wiry strength, worked from dawn until the last light failed. She laid the foundation with stones she and Kaiser hauled from the creek bed. Then came the bales, stacked like enormous golden bricks, one on top of the other, staggered at the corners for strength. The walls rose with shocking speed, thick and solid and utterly alien to the landscape of thin, vertical boards that defined the town. Mr. Rowe would often ride his horse to the edge of her plot, reining in to watch her. He never dismounted. He'd sit in his saddle, a monument of skeptical authority. "You're building a home for mice and field rats, not a woman," he called out one afternoon, a smirk playing on his lips. "That first rain will turn it to mush. The first heavy snow will flatten it like a pancake." Agnes did not stop her work. She simply looked up, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow with the back of a muddy hand. "I'll trust the earth, Mr. Rowe," she replied, her voice even and clear. "It's given more than it's taken from me," he scoffed and rode away. Mr. Finch, the owner of the general store, took a different approach. He came by on foot, his hands clasped behind his back, exuding an air of paternalistic concern. "Agnes, this is unconventional," he began, gesturing vaguely at the rising walls. "There is no shame in accepting help. If you need credit for proper lumber, for nails, my door is always open." His offer was coated in a syrupy condescension that was more insulting than Rowe's open mockery. "Thank you, Mr. Finch," she said, hoisting another £50 bail into place. "But my accounts are settled." She spent weeks mixing mud, water, and dried grass into a thick plaster, slathering it over the interior and exterior of the straw walls with her bare hands. It was grueling, repetitive work, but as the thick, earthen skin covered the bales, the structure transformed. It ceased to be a pile of straw and became a fortress, solid and silent, its texture organic, its shape a gentle curve against the harsh lines of the prairie. The town settled on a name for it, the haystack. Sometimes it was Agnes's folly, or, among the more charitable ladies of the church sewing circle, that poor woman's hovel. Children would dare each other to run up and touch its strange, lumpy walls, then run away shrieking with laughter. When Agnes walked into town for supplies, conversations would fall silent. She would feel the weight of eyes on her back, a mixture of pity and contempt. She learned to make her trips brief, buying only what was necessary: salt, flour, coffee. She spent more and more time alone, with only Kaiser for company. The big dog seemed to feel her isolation and became her shadow, his warm presence a constant reassurance. She found herself talking to him as she worked, her voice a low murmur against the prairie silence. "They think we're fools, Kaiser," she'd say, smoothing the final coat of plaster near the roofline. "They think strength is about how tall and sharp something is. They don't understand that real strength is about knowing how to bend, how to yield." As autumn deepened, the mockery became a settled fact, a piece of town law. The haystack was a landmark of foolishness, a story the men would tell over whiskey at the saloon. But Agnes, inside her thick, quiet walls, felt a growing sense of peace. The house was already proving itself. On windy nights, the cabins in town rattled and groaned, but hers was still. On the first cold snap, when frost laced the inside of the town's window frames, her small stove kept the single room remarkably warm, the heat held captive by the dense walls. The air outside began to change. The wind carried a new kind of bite, a crystalline sharpness that promised a winter of unusual severity. The first snows came early, not as a gentle dusting, but as a heavy, wet blanket that took 2 days to melt. Agnes felt the urgency. The town saw it as an inconvenience. They saw a few inches of snow. She saw a warning. The cold did not just arrive, it laid siege to the prairie. By mid-November, the ground was frozen solid, and the creek was a ribbon of thick, grey ice. The sun was a pale, distant wafer in the sky, offering little light and no warmth at all. The very air seemed thin and brittle. The usual winter birds had vanished. The coyotes, which normally yipped and howled through the nights, fell silent. An unnatural stillness settled over the land, a quiet that felt heavy and full of intent. Kaiser grew restless. He would pace the single room, whining softly, his nose pressed against the crack beneath the heavy wooden door. He refused to go far from the house, staying within the small circle of its protection. Agnes took these signs seriously. She spent a week making her final preparations. She recorked the mud plaster around the doorframe and the 2 small window openings. She secured the oiled hides with extra leather straps, making them as taut and weatherproof as possible. She banked soil and sod high against the foundation, creating an extra berm of insulation that made the house look as if it were growing directly from the frozen earth. She double-checked the flue for her stove, ensuring it was clear and drawing perfectly. Her woodpile was modest but stacked with dense, slow-burning oak, every piece chosen for its efficiency. In town, life continued with a stubborn, almost willful ignorance. Smoke plumed from every chimney, a sign of prosperity and comfort. But it was a false comfort. Their timber houses, built with pride and straight lines, were thermal sieves. The wind found every crack, every seam in the planking. They had to burn enormous amounts of wood just to keep the chill at bay, their stoves roaring day and night, consuming fuel at a prodigious rate. They saw Agnes's final preparations not as wisdom, but as the desperate puttering of a lonely, eccentric woman. They were secure in their numbers, in their shared belief in the superiority of milled lumber. They were men of progress, and she was a relic of some imagined, primitive past. They were warm enough, for now. And they believed enough was the same as safe. The storm did not announce its arrival. It simply appeared. One moment, the world was a still, frozen landscape under a pewter sky. The next, the sky was on the ground. A solid wall of white, moving faster than a galloping horse, consumed the prairie and fell upon the town of Providence. It was not snow in any recognizable form. There were no delicate flakes. It was a horizontal blizzard of ice pellets and blinding powder, driven by a wind that didn't howl, but screamed. The sound was a physical thing, a solid roar that vibrated deep in the chest. It was the sound of the world being torn apart. Within minutes, visibility dropped to zero. A man couldn't see his own hand in front of his face. The town was instantly plunged into a state of chaos and disbelief. Men caught out between the saloon and their homes were lost, stumbling blind in a roaring, white vortex. Doors that had been shut were blasted open by the sheer force of the wind. The fine, sharp snow, like sand, found its way through every crack, every keyhole, piling in ghostly drifts inside the houses. The temperature plummeted. It dropped 10 degrees in as many minutes, then 10 more. The cold was no longer a condition, it was an active, malevolent predator. It sought out life with a vicious intensity. The proud, sharp-angled buildings of Providence, which had looked so strong and permanent just an hour before, were now revealed for what they were, fragile boxes, wholly inadequate for the fury that had been unleashed. The townsfolk, who had pitied Agnes for her foolishness, were now trapped in their own. Their confidence, their conventional wisdom, had become the architecture of their cage, and the walls were beginning to tremble. The real test had come, not as a slow erosion, but as a sudden, violent reckoning. Inside the straw house, the apocalypse was a rumor. The moment the storm hit, the world outside simply ceased to exist. The monstrous, deafening roar of the wind, a sound that was shaking the very foundations of the timber buildings in town, was transformed by the thick, porous walls into a deep, resonant hum. It was like the gentle, vibrating purr of some colossal sleeping animal. The light through the oiled hides dimmed, plunging the room into a cozy, womb-like twilight. The air inside remained perfectly still and warm. The small iron stove, fed with a single piece of oak, radiated a steady, gentle heat that the straw bales absorbed and held, creating an envelope of thermal stability. There were no drafts. No rattling. No sense of siege. Agnes sat in her rocking chair, the half-mended sock still in her lap. She was not afraid. She was not even particularly tense. She was simply present, bearing witness to the proof of a theory. She felt a profound connection to Samuel, a sense that his quiet, earthy wisdom was alive in the very walls around her, protecting her. Kaiser, who should have been terrified by the storm's fury, was utterly serene. He lay stretched out on the rag rug before the stove, his body relaxed, his breathing deep and even. He had not barked or whined once. His animal senses told him what the men in town could not comprehend: this shelter was part of the earth. It was not fighting the storm, it was indifferent to it. It was a badger's set, a fox's den, a natural extension of the landscape's own resilience. Agnes rose and placed another small log in the stove, the metallic click of the latch the only sharp sound in the muffled room. She looked around at her small, safe world and felt not triumph, but a deep and sorrowful gratitude. The storm could rage. The world could tear itself to pieces. But in here, there was only peace. Even through 3 feet of straw and mud, some sounds from the town's destruction were sharp enough to pierce the calm. Around midnight, a high-pitched, tearing shriek cut through the storm's deep hum, the unmistakable sound of a large roof surrendering to the wind. It was followed, a few moments later, by a heavy, resonant crash that vibrated through the frozen ground. Agnes put her hand on Kaiser's back, and the dog's muscles tensed for a moment before relaxing under her touch. She tried to imagine what it was like in one of those timber cabins. She thought of Mr. Rowe's house, the biggest in town, built from his own finest lumber. She pictured the thin walls vibrating with every gust, the fine snow forcing its way through the window sashes, the constant, unnerving groan of the timbers as they strained against the immense pressure. He would be stoking his large fireplace furiously, burning through his woodpile at an alarming rate, yet the cold would be creeping in from all sides, a relentless invasion. She thought of Mr. Finch's general store, its long, vulnerable walls lined with shelves of goods. She imagined the windows breaking, the wind and snow blasting through the store, turning flour to paste and freezing canned goods solid. He would be desperately trying to nail boards over the openings, his fingers numb, his heart pounding with the fear of financial ruin. For the people of Providence, the night would be a terrifying battle for survival. They would be listening to the anatomy of their own failure, every creak a prelude to collapse, every shudder a testament to their misplaced faith in the strength of wood alone. Their homes were not shelters, they were drums, amplifying the storm's fury, making them participants in their own destruction. They were cold, they were terrified, and they were trapped inside the very structures that symbolized their pride. The sound of their world breaking apart was the only thing they could hear. The silence that followed the storm was more profound than the noise had been. Agnes woke from a light sleep in her chair to a world that was utterly still. The deep hum was gone. A bright, diffused light pressed against the oiled hides. She went to the door, her heart beating a little faster now. It wouldn't budge. She pushed harder, and it gave only a fraction of an inch, stopped by a solid weight. A thick drift had buried the entrance completely. For a moment, a sliver of panic touched her, but she pushed it away. She had a shovel. She had strength. It took her the better part of an hour, digging away the dense, packed snow from the inside and pushing it into the room until she had carved a narrow passage. When the door finally swung open, she stepped out into a changed world. The sun was brilliant on a landscape of pure, sculpted white. The snow was piled in immense drifts, some 12 or 15 feet high, erasing the familiar lines of the prairie. And the town of Providence was gone. Where a street of proud, wooden buildings had stood, there was now only a junkyard of ruin. The roof of the general store had collapsed inward, a great V of broken timbers. The saloon had been pushed half off its foundation, leaning at a drunken, impossible angle. Mr. Rowe's impressive two-story house was a pile of splintered planks and shattered siding, its chimney standing alone like a tombstone. Her house, the haystack, was the only structure left fully intact. It looked like a natural feature of the landscape, a gentle, snow-covered hillock from which a thin tendril of smoke now curled, a quiet declaration of life. As she stood there, taking in the sheer totality of the devastation, figures began to emerge from the wreckage. They were dazed, wrapped in blankets, their faces etched with shock and disbelief. They stumbled through the deep snow, their eyes fixing on the impossible sight, Agnes, standing safe and sound outside her absurd, indestructible home. Mr. Rowe was among them. He stared, his face pale, his gaze moving from the pile of lumber that was his home to the gentle curve of hers. The mockery was gone from his eyes, replaced by a raw, hollowed-out incomprehension. They came to her not all at once, but in small, defeated groups. They trudged through the deep snow, their pride stripped away, their faces raw from the cold and the shock of their losses. They did not come for shelter, not at first. They came for an explanation. They gathered in a loose, silent semicircle around her door, their breath pluming in the frigid air, and simply stared at the house. They touched the mud-plastered walls, their fingers tracing the smooth, hard surface as if trying to understand a miracle. Mr. Rowe was the first to speak, his voice raspy and broken. How? It was not a question of engineering, but of philosophy. It was the sound of a man whose entire worldview had just been dismantled. Agnes looked at him, at his fine coat now torn and dusted with snow, and felt no desire for vindication. she saw only a man who was cold and afraid. "The walls are thick," she said simply. "They hold the warmth and ignore the wind." Mr. Finch, his face grey with exhaustion, stepped forward. His store, his entire livelihood, was a frozen ruin. "We lost everything, Agnes," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The food, the medicine. Everything." He looked past her, into the warm, dim interior of the house where Kaiser sat watching, a silent, furry sentinel. Can you show us?" he asked, the words heavy with a humility he had never before known. "Can you teach us how to build like this?" It was the moment of ultimate reversal. The woman they had mocked as a fool was now their only source of wisdom. The structure they had ridiculed as a hovel was now the blueprint for their survival. Agnes nodded slowly. "There is coffee on the stove," she said, her voice steady and kind. "Come inside. Get warm. Then we will talk about how to rebuild." Her home, born of a $3 investment and a husband's memory, became the town's heart. It was the infirmary, the kitchen, and the council hall. And its humble, earthen walls became the foundation, not just for new houses, but for a new understanding of what it meant to endure. The strength of Providence, they learned, was not in the proud timber that snaps, but in the humble straw that yields, that absorbs, that quietly, stubbornly, holds.